Hi, my name is Akash, and in this video, I'll be showing you how I went about building this really nice expandable tag, component with frame of motion, React, Tailwind CSS. So this expandable tag actually reveals some content when you hover over the tag, and we'll be dealing with various issues and edge cases that comes when you're building a component like this. And we'll also explore a lot of frame of motions, magic layout animations, animate presence, exit animations, and so on. And at the end, you'll have something like this. When you turn on vertical alignment, things just automatically move towards the correct alignment, center, things work magically. And you'll be surprised by the code that we write. It's quite less, and I think you have already gotten a hint of it. It's just 85 lines. So yeah, I hope you learned something from this, and let's get started. I have a basic project set up over here with Vite, React, and Tailwind CSS, and I have a basic tag component over here. It just has the styles using Tailwind for a tag component, and it has some text over here, as you can see. Now what I want is that when the user hovers over this tag, I want the content inside this tag to change. Now in the demo that we are building, what we have right now, 4.5M, is shorthand for 4,500,000 something. And when the user hovers over this 4.5 million, it should actually expand and show the entire number in its full form. So to add this functionality, let's make use of certain events, because obviously we can't use the hover pseudo selector in CSS. Hover pseudo selector can only be used for applying hover styles, but in this case we are changing the content of the element based on hover, and for that we'll have to use JavaScript. So JavaScript actually has two events that we can make use of. One is on mouse enter and on mouse leave. So on mouse enter is triggered when the mouse enters an element, and the leave gets triggered when the mouse leaves that element. And to actually keep track of whether the user is hovering over an element or not, let's actually create a state. So I'll just create a state variable. So is hovering, set is hovering, use state, and initially it will be set to false. And over here in the event, I can now set my state. So when the mouse enters an element, that will be the hover state. So I'll set is hovering to true. And when the mouse leaves the element, that is when the hovered state will be false. And based on this hovered state value, I can actually update my content. So when the user is hovering, I want to show the complete value, which can be, let's say, 4,540,231. And when the user is not hovering, it will just be 4.5. Nice. So if I come over here, refresh, and if I hover over my tag, if I hover out, you can see it works as expected. When the user is not hovering, we are showing unhovered text, which is 4.5M. And when we hover over it, it shows the hovered text, which is 4,540,000 and so on. Nice. Now it looks nice, but there are two major issues in this element that we have. The first one is it's not really animated. It just happens really quickly. And I think this kind of an interaction, usually when you're using hover pseudo selector, we are able to define the transition for the styles. But here, since we are using JavaScript, it's it's just happening immediately, and there's no interaction, no animation. It just the change happens really quickly. And the second problem that is there is that let's say right now, if I change the hovered text to be something shorter than the unhovered text, let's say I make the hovered text just 4. What happens is, if I hover over this element from one corner, it is fine. But if I, let's say, hover over the element towards the end, so if I hover over it now, notice how the element has gone into this weird quantum state where it's actually both in hovered and unhovered state at the same time, and it's causing this flicker. I'm ashamed to say that this kind of a flicker behavior is also there in some of my past projects, and it usually happens when you're doing these transformations in hover or active or focused or all these kind of states. where the element has actually moved from its original position and it triggers another event, and when it triggers the other event, it resets back to its position and that triggers another event. So it's causing this infinite loop of events triggering each other, and that's why it causes this weird glitchy jitter flickering behavior of the element being in two states at the same time. Let's actually go about fixing the two issues. The first one was about animation and some interaction. So we can do that by using something like frame of motion, and I have frame of motion already installed in this project. So I'm using frame of motion version 10.12.4 at the time of this recording. And to actually add some animation, what we'll do is we'll start by first fading out the unhovered text, so that will fade out, and then the hovered text will fade in to reveal itself. So to do that, let's actually import the motion component from frame of motion, and then within this div, let's use motion.span, and let's simply put the is hovering markup inside motion.span. Now let's define our animation. So for fading in, initially the element will start with an opacity of 0, and then when it fades in, it will actually change to opacity of 1, and then when we want it to fade out, it will exit with an opacity of 0. And in this example, I'm just using opacity. If you want, you can do other funky animations. In this demo, I'll just be using opacity. And let's actually save. Let's come back to the browser. And as you can see, well, we are using frame of motion, but still we're not able to see any difference. Now, if you refresh the page, you'll see something happens. You can see the text is actually fading in. So frame of motion is doing something, but what we wanted was actually changing. When the content changes, we want the fade in and fade out to happen, and that is not happening. So what do we do? Well, frame of motion actually cannot identify when your content has changed. It needs some trigger for it to run the animations again. And the way the trigger works is using the key prop, which React already has. So in this motion.span, we can pass key equals something that will basically tell frame of motion that the content has changed and you should rerun the animation. And in our case, that is, that trigger is really clear. It's simply this state variable. When the state changes, the content changes, and that is when we want the animation to change. So we can simply do when the state is hovering is true, let's set the key as hovering, and when it's not true, basically when it's false, we'll just set it to unhovering. Nice. Let's refresh. If I hover over, you can see the animation is running, but this still has some problems. Let me actually reduce or rather make this animation slower. I'll increase the duration, refresh. So the content first fades in on mount, and we don't want that. So we'll actually go about eliminating that as well. But if I hover over the element now, notice how 4.5M just disappeared and then 4 is fading in. The 4.5M did not fade out as we wanted it to. So it just disappears and then the next content fades in. And now if I unhover, the 4 will disappear and 4.5M will fade in. So fade out is not working. And the reason it's not working is because whenever you're using exit animations in frame of motion, you need to also use the animate presence component. Now, I don't want to go, get into the technical details of animate presence itself, but as a general rule, whenever you're using exit animations, it'll only work when you have animate presence in the parent of the child. So let's also import this from frame of motion. And now if I refresh the page, we have this initial animation that is running when the component mounts, and we don't want that. So now we can actually turn that off by simply setting initial in this animate presence to be false. So this will block the animation from running when the component mounts for the first time. If I refresh now, notice how the fade in does not happen in the first render. And now when I hover over this tag, you can see 4.5M fades out and then 4 fades in simultaneously. 4 fades out now and 4.5M fades in simultaneously. Now the behavior is working as we wanted it to, but what is happening is both are happening at the same time, which is not giving a really nice look. So we want the fade out to happen and only then the fade in should start. We don't want both of them to happen simultaneously. So to fix this, it's really simple. What we can do is we can set this mode at mode prop in animate presence, and there are three options. The first one is pop layout, then sync, and then wait. Sync is what is set by default. This is when the elements fade out and fade in. Basically, the entry and exit are synced together. We want the mode to be wait. So what will happen is the entry of an element or the entry animation will wait before the exit animation plays out. So once the exit is done, only then the entry will start. So if I save, refresh, now if I hover over this, notice how 4.5M fades out, and once it fades out completely, 4 fades in, which is really nice. Now I can remove this transition because this is very slow. So if I remove that, refresh, now if I hover over, it works as expected. Really nice. So it fades out and fades in, and it resets as we want it to. Nice. Now this works as expected. We have some motion in the content, but our actual tag, which is this gray box that you can see, if you notice, if I hover over this, notice how the size of the box itself just snaps into place immediately, and the fade in and fade out of the content happens. If I unhover, the size of the tag immediately expands, and then the content also gradually appears. Now this is, in my opinion, not a nice behavior. You have animation in one place, but the layout or the container itself is not animated to accommodate that animation, and this snapping is not really giving a really nice feel. So let's actually add some motion to the container itself, the tag element, and to do that we can convert this div, the wrapping div, which is the tag element, to a motion component as well. So I'll just change this to motion.div. And how do we make the div respond to the change happening within its children? Well, it's quite simple. We just need to add a layout prop to tell Framer that there will be some layout changes happening in this element, and you need to animate all those layout changes for it to look good. Now the layout prop itself takes 3 values: position, preserve, aspect, and size. You can choose to only animate the position of this element or the size, but in our case we just want to animate the layout as a whole. So if we just pass layout as layout equals true, it will tell Framer that okay, animate both the size and the positioning. So if I save this, if I refresh, you'll see nothing happens. Now I'm not sure if this is a bug or if this is how it's supposed to work, but whenever you're using animate presence with mode equals wait, and you have some layout animation layout element in the as an ancestor, you need to also have a layout group wrapping the entire element. So I'll actually wrap the entire motion.div here with a layout group. So, and this layout group actually comes from Framer motion, and it basically tells Framer that whenever you have some changes happening within this animate presence, it can trigger layout effects outside this element itself. So once we have this setup, if I refresh, if I hover over, and if I unhover, notice how it smoothly expands and smoothly contracts. Really nice. Awesome. So this looks really nice. We have really nice smooth animation happening, but if I, let's say, make the text larger now, let's say I make this 405, let me just type in few random numbers to make it a really long text. Now what happens is, if I refresh, so I'm not sure if you're able to see, let me actually make the animation slower. So if I make the duration of the layout animation itself to be 5 seconds, if I refresh, ignore the content, but I'm not sure if you saw, yeah, look at this. When I unhover, the border radius is completely messed up of this tag itself. You can see it looks really bad, and that is because these layout animations are working with transforms, CSS transform, scale, and so on. And when you're using those transforms, it can actually mess around with your other, CSS styles, which is border radius, box shadow, and so on. And to fix it, what you have to do is, instead of using the class name, the Tailwind class, for applying the border radius, I'm using I think rounded LG over here. So instead of using other classes, you need to pass it as an inline style to the frame or motion component itself. So if I pass in border radius as 6, which is for 6 pixels, and then I can remove this rounded LG class. If I save and refresh, it should have fixed the problem. So if I expand and then if I leave, notice how the border radius is still maintained and it looks correct whenever it's scaled. So that solves the problem for us. So now I can actually remove this transition so that it plays correctly. So now if I refresh, it expands, it shrinks. Very nice. Awesome. So this solves the first problem that we had, where the animations were not really there because we were, modifying the content using JavaScript. And now we have introduced some animations and it actually adds a really nice effect. So let me bring back this to some real value. So 4,503,000, let's say 231. Let's now look at the second problem. So the second problem was, if I come towards the end of an element, and for this to happen, the hovered text should actually be smaller than the unhovered text. So if I save, if I refresh, if I hover towards the edge, you can see this animation happening again and again. Now, initially when we started, we did not have any animation and it was just, causing flickering between the two states. But now that we have animations, it does not look that bad in my opinion. It still, goes to one state gradually and then comes back to its original state gradually. That's fine. But I feel that this is still an underlying problem and we haven't solved for it. And, if you're using this component, as a part of an entire UI, these small things might, cause, other layout animations and jittering across your entire UI. So it's better we solve for it. So what is the underlying problem that's causing this? Well, it's quite simple. When we hover over this element, it actually shrinks, and then JavaScript thinks that we have unhovered the element. So we set the is hovering to false, and that causes the element to come back to its original state, which is actually increasing the size of the element. And then it again thinks that we are hovering over it. So it again does the hover interaction and then it goes into that infinite loop. To fix this, the way you go about fixing these problems is to actually have another element outside your element that is actually animating, which will act as your interaction element. So that will handle all the interactions, but your actual animation will happen on another element. So to do this, we'll wrap our entire motion.div here with another div. Okay. And instead of listing on mouse enter and on mouse leave on this div, this motion.div, which also has layout animations, we'll now listen to these events on this outer div. And this div that we have here is purely for interaction purpose. This won't animate, or it won't even be shown to the user. Okay. Now to see this div in action and understand what it's actually doing, let me actually add a style. Let's set the background color to be green 500. And you can see that green box over here. Now, if I hover over the element, you can see the green box is shrinking and it's expanding accordingly. Now, what we want to do is that this original size of the tag, what we have, we need to maintain the interaction element size to always be this much. So whenever I hover over this tag, the interaction element size should not change, irrespective of whether the hovered state tag size changes or not. We still want to maintain that minimum width. And if we maintain that minimum width, we will still be hovering over that element, and that won't trigger the infinite, JavaScript events causing jitters in the UI. So to explain it better, let's try something. So I'll actually set the, let's say I'll just set the width of this element to be, let's say 20. In fact, this is a Tailwind class. This has to go over here. Yeah. So if I hover over this green box now, it'll trigger the layout animation on the tag, and you can see nothing is happening. I'm still hovering outside my original tag, But since I'm listening to events on this green box, I'm still in the hovered state, which is actually correct. And it's not causing any, jitters in the UI. But when I hover outside the box, the green box, it thinks it becomes the unhovered state and the tag actually resets to its original form. Now this is an extreme example just to explain the concept, but what we will do is we'll maintain the original width of the tag and we won't, reset the green box's width to the shrunk tag size when it's hovered. So let's actually do this. I'll remove this width 20 over here, and we need to capture the width of this motion.div before the hovered text has appeared. So to do that, I'll actually create a ref first to actually get a ref to the motion div component itself. Okay, and this use ref comes from React, and then we'll also store the width of that component, of that element, in another ref. So we want to store it when the user has just hovered over the element, but the hovered text is not shown. So we'll just capture the width before the set is hovering is set to true. So here I'll just set the width dot current to be the value of whatever the width of this motion.div is. Now how do we get the width of an element? Well, it's quite simple. We just use ref. We just use the offset width property that's there in the elements. And TypeScript thinks that the ref.current might be a null. So for now, I'll just ignore this error. And the offset width itself, so it's again a TypeScript issue. I'll just specify that this is actually an HTML div element, and that solves that. So what we're doing is we are capturing the width of this motion.div and storing it in a ref before the hover text has appeared. And how will we use this width? Well, we'll simply set the width of this green box to be whatever the value is in that ref that we have. Now this won't really work as expected because obviously the initial state has width of 0. So we essentially end up making this green box width to be 0, which is not really what we want. So instead of setting width, we'll actually set min width, and this will actually work in favor for us because whenever min width is 0, it just says that your lower bound is supposed to be 0, but you can allow higher values of width. And as we just saw, this problem that we have only occurs when the width of the hovered state is lower than the unhovered state. So this min width here works in our favor. So if I save the change, if I refresh, notice when I hover over the tag, the width of the green box is still the same as how it was as the original state. Now when I unhover, the tag resets to its original state. And this works as expected. Now we don't have any of the glitching that was happening before. So if I remove my class name over here, we don't want this to be shown to the user, obviously. If I refresh the page, it'll work as expected. I'll hover over 4.5m, and notice how I'm still hovering over the hovering outside the actual tag itself, but I did not trigger unhover interaction. Here I'm still unhovering, but when I hover sufficiently out, it expands back to its original state, which is really nice. And this works in our favor, and it solves the flickering issue that was happening. But there's still one problem, and I think you might have noticed what's happening. Notice how when I quickly hover over this element, let's say I just hover over it and leave like this, it goes in the hovered state, but I'm not actually hovering over the tag right now. So it's actually inconsistent. So if I go to it again, now it's right. If I come back, now it's in the unhovered state. So now it's fine. But when I do it quickly, frame of motion is not resolving the animations, and it's going in this inconsistent state. So what is happening? So apparently this is a bug in frame of motion. This is the GitHub issue. So essentially what is happening is the animate presence component that we are using, it does not update with the latest state when the state data changes really fast. And at the time of the recording, the latest version of frame of motion, which is version 10.12.4, has this bug. And I'm not sure when you're watching this video, but maybe by the time you're watching this, the bug might have been resolved. You should see that the issue is closed probably. And if you're not facing this problem, you can just skip this part of the video But yeah, if you're facing this problem where hovering over the tag quickly, does not, give the consistent state, that means the bug is still there. And as of now, the only way to solve this is to downgrade to an older version of Frame of Motion, which did not have this bug. And that happens to be version 9.0.2. So I'll just change my Frame of Motion version, which is over here, to 9.0.2, and reinstall my dependencies and come back. Okay, so I have installed Frame of Motion version 9.0.2. Now I'll give the page a refresh, and now I'll hover over this tag quickly. So you can see now it's not happening. So if I hover over it and then I exit quickly, you can see Frame of Motion is able to figure out when to cancel the animation, and it works as expected. Nice. So the animation is getting interrupted and it resets back to the original state that it's supposed to be in. Nice. It works as expected. So now we have solved most of the problems that we had. Let's actually extract this entire implementation that we have done to its own separate component so that we can reuse it. So I'll take the entire markup from this layout group and extract it in another component. I'll call this expandable tag, and I'll return this markup. Cool. And then I'll also move the hooks within the component. And the component itself will take some props. And in this demo, I'll just have two props, which is unhovered text and hovered text. Obviously, you can have more props. You can, make these props as, React node so that you can accept, arbitrary JSX. But for the time being, I'll just stick with strings. Should work fine for me. So I'll just set the hovered text and the unhovered text accordingly. And just to make TypeScript happy, I'll just, for the time being, set this type of the props to be any. But obviously, if you're using this, in a production app, just make sure to set the types correctly. And now let's make use of the component. So I'll use expandable tag. I'll pass unhovered text, which will be 4.5 million, and the hovered text, which will be 4,534,278, some random number. Awesome. Now if I refresh, I should still have the same behavior. It works as expected, expands, contracts. Nice. And if I actually duplicate this a few more times, let me actually change the numbers. Let me make this maybe 3K. This will be 3,210, I guess. And for the last one, I'll just make this the edge case that we just saw when the text is actually, when the hovered text is smaller than the unhovered text. And yeah, let's actually see what's happening. So if I hover over 4.5M, expands, shrinks. If I hover over it quickly, nothing happens. It works as expected. Nice. If I hover over this, fine. Now you'll notice there's, some glitches still in the UI. You can see when I hover over it, sometimes you can see now the layout does not reset correctly, and it snaps back, and it's not smooth in general when you're using these this component together with the rest of the UI. So to actually resolve these errors, let's actually look at the code over here now. So there are a few things that are happening. The first one being that this entire component itself, first of all, since we are using a div over here, it's actually a block element. And if I'm using this in isolation, I look at tags especially as an inline element because it's mostly used with other inline elements. So originally this motion.div was the actual tag and that had inline block, and we have kind of lost that with this wrapping div. So I'll just bring that back by setting this outer div to also be an inline block. Cool. And then the other problem that is happening is that apparently when we are using these events on mouse enter and on mouse leave, sometimes what happens is when you hover over the child of an element which has these events, that causes the event to bubble up, and it again ends up triggering the on mouse enter and on mouse leave. So if I hover over the tag itself, the animation or the hover unhover happens only once, which is as expected. But if I hover over the text and if I unhover, it causes this to run twice, and that causes us to actually calculate the width of the element in its hovered state, which is actually incorrect. This entire thing that we had done over here, it was only to capture the width of the element when it's in unhovered state. So to solve this error, what we can do is we can only capture the width when the is hovering variable is false, and when it's false, I'll capture the width, and when it's not false, I'll just ignore it. And this line over here, well, this is an idempotent operation, so even if it sets the state to true multiple times, doesn't really matter. It still gives us the same output. So I'll save that, I'll refresh, and now that shouldn't happen. So I'm hovering over the text. Notice how the layout still snaps back to its original place. So we don't have that stray white space gap anymore. Nice. And for semantics, since we are using on mouse enter and on mouse leave, this kind of an interaction that we are building right now, this is more suited towards devices which have a pointer, again, something like desktop, laptops, or PCs or whatever. Mostly the touch devices like tablets and mobiles don't have any sort of hover interaction defined, so they don't really make sense. And we don't want them to run when you are using those devices. So instead of using on mouse enter, on mouse leave, let's actually make use of some gesture callbacks that frame a motion exposes. So to make use of those gesture callbacks, we actually have to change this div to again another motion component, even though we won't be applying any animation to it. So I'll just change this to motion.div, and instead of using on mouse enter and on mouse leave, frame a motion exposes on hover start and on hover end, which again, the name explains it, but this runs when the user hovers over the element, and this runs when the user unhovers the element. So I'll just move my code to on hover start and this one to on hover end, and I can remove the old events that we were listening to, and that works really great. Awesome. So we have solved quite a lot of issues. Now it's the fun part. So as you can see, we have 3 tags. Individually, they are animated really well. They work really well in isolation, but when we are using them in together, you can see the layout does not really work really well. You can see the tag is expanded, but the layout, these 2 tags, automatically shifted or snapped to the place really quickly. There was no gradual motion that's happening. Again, a lot of jittering that is happening, which does not look good. So this is the beauty of frame of motion. Now, to make these layout animations really smooth, we simply have to wrap our components with this layout group. That's literally it. That's the magic of frame of motion. It's super declarative, and once you have things set up, the code automatically works for you. So if I refresh the page now, I'll hover over 4.5M. Notice how 3K and 4.5M, the third tag, moved gradually to the position, and then the tag also expanded, and you can see it's so smooth. It looks really nice. Really nice. You can see just by wrapping the component with the layout group, it automatically resolved all the dependencies, how things should move, and it works so really well. So nice. Now this is not the end. We'll actually do some fun stuff by actually playing around with the alignment of these tags. So if I, let's say, do flex call, if I save, and let's say I again reset, you can see the smooth animation happening. So if I again do flex call, you can see frame of motion automatically, without us telling it to do this, it still figures out all these complex layout animations. If I do something like justify center, I think first time it might not happen, but if I, let's say, reset and then run it, you can see the smooth animation happening right there. If I do flex call now, nice, amazing. Now the reason it's not happening the first time, I think it's because I'm using Tailwind CDN, and that generates class names on the fly. So that's probably why frame of motion is not able to resolve the future state of an element. But once it's generated, obviously it's able to. So I think if you're using, the Tailwind CSS with the proper setup and stuff, this issue should not happen. But yeah, if it's still happening, then I'm not sure what the issue might be. If you know, then yeah, do let me know. But yeah, let's actually now add some toggles to actually control the alignment behavior, and let's see what we can do. So I'll just, copy some markup, place it here, and then I'll explain what I've done. Okay, so I'm back. So haven't done a lot. What I've done is I've just added two checkboxes. The first one is for controlling the vertical alignment. Second one is for center. These two checkboxes simply store the state of the checked input in a state variable. And then we are using those two state variables to control certain classes. So when it's vertical, it just does flex call. And when it's center, it just applies all the justify center, item center, the usual stuff to center align a div in HTML. Yeah. So now I come to the demo. So I hover over the elements, works really well. Things reset. There's no flicker when I hover over this and it's still outside. Awesome. If I, let's say, do vertical alignment, well, again, the first one, it obviously snaps because, as I mentioned, I'm using the Tailwind CDN. But if I now do it, it's so smooth. And if I hover over it now, it still expands, works as expected. If I do the center alignment, now it does that smooth animation, expands and shrinks from the center. When we were using left alignment, it was shrinking towards the right, where the left is actually pinned. And if I do center, it actually expands and contracts from both the directions. Really nice. And this one, this smaller hover text, it's still not causing any flicker problems that was happening. So we have come quite far. And as you can see, just by using frame of motion, understanding the components that it exposes and using them together, just gives us this such a nice, fluid UI experience that we can use throughout our UI now. So yeah, that's essentially what I wanted to show you in this video, in this blog post. I hope you learned something, and yeah, thanks for watching.